Welcome to the Futures Forum Live online, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures. On this edition of the Futures Forum Live, we exchange ideas, information, education, and inspiration about the future of Black America. For more information, visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Get Futures Sense now. Share this story and share our future. Stay tuned for a journey to the future with host Dr. Claire Nelson.
Greetings and welcome to Futures Forum Live, an online e-magazine of the Futures Forum. February is Black History Month, and so we're having a conversation on the future history of Black America. Specifically, I want to examine how Blacks in America might be faring in the year 2030 and beyond. 2030 is considered a full year, with all the countries, United Nations, setting 17 goals called the Sustainable Development Goals for achieving greater human prosperity by 2030. And goal number 10 focuses specifically on inequality. Well, here in the US, by 2030, it is said that we'll become a majority-minority country and will no longer be the world's only superpower. So what might this mean for the Black community in America, in the United States of America? And how might the economic, social, and technological shifts emerging impact the well-being of Blacks in America? In this episode, I'll be speaking to Marcia Blanco, who is a legal counsel for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights on the Law. Her work is involved with protecting voter rights and clearly means protecting the political inclusion of Blacks in America. So without further ado, let me say greetings and welcome Marcia Blanco. How are you?
Hello, Dr. Nelson. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really pleased you could join us. I think you'll round up this conversation for 2019, looking at the political inclusion aspect of things. Well, you might be aware that 2030 is a poll year, as I might say. And if I paint a picture of 2030, we're talking about a world with 8 billion people. We're talking a world where artificial intelligence will be everywhere. We'll have the Internet of Things, over 400 billion mobile phones. People are assuming we will have a much higher rate of formal unemployment. There's an assumption that the whole union movement will be backed up against the wall. I mean, a lot of things are being outpictured as we think about the rising crescendo of how technology is being embedded in our society. As you think about this from your perspective as somebody working to ensure political inclusion and political equity, how do you see 2030 rising? What does it look like for you?
Well, what 2030 looks like is going to depend on several things. It's going to depend on the election of 2020 and who wins that election. Also in 2020, the United States is going to be going through a census, and there's a current challenge to whether there's going to be a citizenship question on the census or not. Whether that question is on the census will determine who fills it out, and then that's going to determine what the data looks like. And as we know, the census is used to draw electoral districts, to reapportion and equalize electoral districts. So that data is going to determine how many representative states are going to have and how and what those districts look like. So from a political and a democracy perspective, we're looking at who the leader is after the 2020 presidential election and how districts are going to be drawn after the census results come out in 2021. And so will we have a country that reflects the growing diversity? You know, you mentioned it's going to be a majority-minority country. Will the electoral leaders reflect that majority-minority? Will they have policies that support a majority-minority electorate? Or will we have what we currently have, which is a leader who is focused solely on his base and is pushing policies that are limited only to his base? And also, we have a leader who does not believe in climate change. Climate change is going to be a huge factor in the economy of countries, and that means the resources of countries. We currently have a leader who is taking away the social safety net that many people need. And we also have an economy that is focused on what the stock market is doing and not on whether people have the jobs they need in order to live a very comfortable and viable life. So the leadership of the country is going to be a really big factor, I think, in what 2030 looks like. On one hand, you have leadership catering to a very particular base and is not really actively trying to address the challenges that we're currently facing. Or we may have a new leader who is willing to look at the population of the United States as a whole and try to address the many challenges that we're facing both economically and with the climate in the future.
So I want to come back to the issue of political inclusion and this idea about how that might shape up. So we're going to have 3 elections between now and 2030. But given the state of the data, how data is being collected right now, and the way elections are run in terms of whether it's paper voting or electronic voting, how do you think the technology itself might shape the electoral process? Because is it that assumptions around which, say, the Black community is organizing is based on a 60s mindset, a civil rights mindset of the 60s, and not a civil rights mindset that focuses on how technology might further create either an opportunity or a divide?
Well, technology is going to play an interesting role in several ways. One of the things about technology is how social media is being used to both mobilize but also to deceive. We saw coming out of the 2016 election that the social media, particularly Facebook, was used to spread a particular propaganda to sway engagement in the electoral process. And then we have to look at technology when it comes to voting machines. The United States has a really old voting machine infrastructure, and there is a growing lack of confidence in the electronic voting machines. A lot of states are moving back to paper ballots, and where there are voting machines, there's a push to have audits and as well as a paper trail. So one of the really important ways that technology is going to play a role is not just in how the type of discourse that we have, but also whether our aging voting infrastructure holds up during what is likely to be a really high turnout 2020 presidential election, and whether there's going to be confidence in the results of that election, particularly in states that use electronic voting machines.
This issue of confidence, I think, is probably at the heart of the matter. The idea of trust and how trust is at risk around the world. People are losing confidence in trust because of so much fake information being available, so many false websites, so much, as I said, misinformation or malinformation around what is real and what is not. So as we think also about the census and the impact of how we count, how might the technology also shift participation in the census? Beyond the question about who is a citizen or not, are there particular ways in which the census process itself is evolving which might also impact on how political inclusion emerges in the next over the next 10 years?
Yes, technology is going to play a significant role in the 2020 census because it's going to be the first census that is going to be digital, online. So rather than have the paper form coming to folks in the mail, they're going to get a link to sign in to fill out the census form. So one,
how will they get this link? I mean, does everybody have our email? Is it going to be?
Well, you're going to have information. Yes, the census is going to give information. Sign in here to fill out your census form. And you have the issue of the digital divide.
Mm-hmm.
So who is going to be able to do that easily? You're going to have also the issue of trust, especially when we're having conversations around hacking and digital security, whether the information that is going to be, the infrastructure that's going to be hosting this digital census is one that is secure, and the census say they're working to ensure that that happens. But again, we have this confidence in our infrastructure, confidence in our systems, basically a crisis of confidence in our government and in our infrastructure, and then making sure that who is filling, whether you can fill out the form, and are you on the right website? There are lots of these fake websites that just change the dot. Is it .gov? Is it .com? Is it .org? So there's going to be a lot of education that needs to be done, and there's really going to have to have a lot of effort being made to ensure that those who do not have access to computers and the internet, you're talking about rural communities, for example, where there isn't even a very great internet infrastructure. So there are going to be a lot of, the role of technology in the upcoming census is going to be a really significant one beyond what the questions are that are on the form.
I mean, there's so many things that are buzzing in my mind. We probably would have 2 days to talk about this issue. So let's come to one of the questions in terms of this idea of potential for, let's say, further exclusion owing to technology. Do you believe that there might be, if indeed we have then a lack of attention to some of this by some of our Black influencers and leaders, do you think that the marketplace that actually wants to continue to be a capitalist marketplace may serve as a, let's say, a lever, a countervailing lever against, let's say, the negative versus the positive? How do you think that tension between politics and the market might play out?
Yeah, I think that, we're in a time that offers a lot of opportunity for what I call social entrepreneurism. I mean, we are in a capitalist society, and that is the driver of innovation and communication and how we engage with each other. And so it does offer an opportunity for, as you were saying, who are the trusted voices in the Black community who can engage with the community about how best to be a part of and to engage both in the elections and in the census and the conversations that we have with the government. One of the things that we saw during the 2016 election is that, there were reports that bad actors use these false Black Lives Matters platforms or information about the African American community to try to dissuade particularly young people from voting and engaging in the process. So really having those trusted voices, and those trusted voices using trusted platforms to communicate with the African American community is going to be really, really important moving forward.
Do you think this conversation is happening in the Black community at a sufficient level and intensity to actually begin to, let's say, impact on the potential negative things that could happen?
I think it's starting to happen, but the question is, within what bubbles, right? So it's happening in, for example, the world I'm in, which is the voting community. But is that conversation happening in the communities on the ground? Is it happening with the public? And that is something that there needs to be more conversation about. I think one of the things that's getting in the way of that conversation beginning is some of the things I mentioned earlier. It's there's a current mistrust of the infrastructure, both within communities and then also within the advocates and leaders, is what kind of platform can I use and how can I engage my community over these platforms? And so, technology is seen both as an opportunity, but also a threat. And I think with all the news that came out of 2016, there's now a focus on how do we manage the threat while trying to engage on the opportunity. We have a lot of young people, they're online, and they're actually using platforms that those of us who are older may not even be on.
Yes.
And then there's the question of when you have to be invited into the communities that are using particular platforms, how do you get into those communities? How do you engage with the young people in those communities? And then also, how do you talk to them? Because we have we have a 280 character, vocabulary that some of us who are older may not be able to really shrink our message or what we want to say down to the speak that young people that resonate with young people. How do you have a conversation on Instagram that's photo based? And so it's not just the vehicle for the message, but how do you best engage on the message and then across a range of demographics?
So I'm hearing so many things in terms of what might be important to create a future of well-being for Black America going forward. How might you see let's say the civil rights movement of the 2020 decade emerging? What does that look like? I mean, we marched in the 60s. What are people going to be doing in the 2020s, 2025, in order to ensure that there is not, let's say, a backward move in terms of access and equal opportunity?
Yeah, I think we're trying to figure out what that looks like right now. You have the online, it's called the Twitter protests where, click this link or I, do the thumbs down or I send out a tweet about something. And that doesn't really involve a very sustained long-term engagement. I do think we need to, within the Black community, develop a multi-pronged strategy. Yes, there is having the conversation online. I think marches are important for several reasons. First, it brings people together to have a conversation. It drives a lot of media attention, which spreads the word about particular issues. But marches alone can't do it. You need the policy engagement, and each cannot be removed from the other. So you need to have this multi-pronged engagement strategy that uses the tools of old, because I think it's really important in terms of marching and community. That brings people together, and it helps to elevate issues. And we know that our political leaders largely pay attention to the issues that the population is lifting up. And so if the population isn't seen as lifting up a particular issue that is both trending on Twitter, in the streets, and are directly talking to election officials about these issues, then we're not going to really be able to make progress on the issues we care about. And I do think this multi-pronged strategy is a way to also have an intergenerational conversation and also use intergenerational tools where each generation can use the forum that best appeals to them.
Back in the past, the Black church was very important in sort of being a space for mobilization of consciousness. Do you think that in the future, the Black church will continue to play that role, or given the decreasing numbers of people in the pews, we'll have to find another quote unquote church?
Yeah, I think that the Black church is slowly moving back to that role of being engaged in the movement. I see in my world, there's more and more conversations and programs within the Black church about how it can engage. And there's also that recognition that the Black church is not going to be the sole venue. It's aging
Yes, yes.
and and young people, across the board are not as engaged in the church, and that being a vehicle for change. But I do think it has a role to play. I think it's currently doing some examination and thinking about how it can re-engage in that role. For example, in my work in 2016, we formed a partnership with the clergy that was called Lawyers and Callers. And it's about how the clergy can work with lawyers to lift up information about voting rights, and then also to help with voter protection efforts. So I do think there are going to be pockets where programs like that are going to be on the rise again. And then you have someone like Reverend Barber, who is really lifting up, the moral majority, Moral Mondays, and having a broader conversation about how the issues intersect with our political participation. So there are pockets where the church is really engaging people, and it's starting to be more of a process of engagement than it was in recent years.
Do you think, and I'm going to go on a limb here, do you think that actually when you think about all of what's happening in terms of this idea, come back to the issue of trust and technology and the way things are shaping up, do you think democracy, American style, is at stake? Would you go as far as to say American style democracy is at stake?
I do think so. I think democracy is very much at stake. We have, as I said, after the 2016 election, we have the leader of the country who's just really focused on a very narrow base of the population and the issues that they care about. We have a Congress that has abdicated its role as an independent branch of government. So we're seeing a growing executive presidency. We're seeing a Congress that is not doing its job. We see a judiciary that, this current president is really stacking the courts with very conservative jurists. In the past, democracy made strides because advocates could go to the courts when the political system failed them for recourse. Now, where you have now, the federal courts are being stacked with people who can't even, during their confirmation hearing, say that they think Brown v. Board of Education is precedent that has to be followed, and who don't have the grounding in our jurisprudential history. We really are at a crossroads right now in our democracy. And I really believe, as I said, that 2020 is going to dictate what direction our democracy goes in. Are we going to have more of this dictatorial executive focus, where the other branches of government are either being co-opted or not doing their job? Or are we going to have a shift based on a more inclusive, broader engagement between our political leaders and the public?
So as you think about this, what, as a person who is working on this issue of political inclusion, voting rights, the right to vote, etc., what concerns you most? What keeps you up at night?
Oh, so many things. One is the main concern is a lack of confidence by the people in our democracy. I really believe that this democracy, when it started, was far from perfect. When you look at the right to vote at the beginning, it was limited to white men of property. And it was the people who every generation challenged the government, challenged the country to do better, and pushed and fought for change. And if people get disaffected or have a lack of confidence in the country or what they can do, then there's no longer going to be that pushing for change. And you know the saying that power never gives in willingly. You know, it has to be forced to do so. And so if we have a complacent population that feels cowed by what's happening politically, if we're all focused on our phones and we're not having conversations anymore across different point of views, we're all in our particular bubble, we're becoming more and more divided, and we really need to break out of that, the trend that we're going in. That said, while it's something that concerns me, I try to be optimistic, and I don't think that dismal future that I just talked about is set in stone right now. It's like I said, we're at a crossroads.
Yeah.
And
So what's the future of the American dream? Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. I mean, can the American lifestyle of 2.5 children and white picket fence and the future, I mean, is that the purpose of continuing to have a democracy based on the past, or is there another way forward?
yeah, no, I think we really, one of the things about the current administration is really forcing us to look at philosophies and economic expectations that we always took for granted. This is the American dream. This is what it means. But when you have tremendous federal debt, student loan debt, credit card debt, there was just a recent report that there are millions of people who can't even keep up with their car loans.
Wow.
And when you have wage stagnation, we really are going to have to have some challenging conversations among ourselves about what does this capitalist system we live in mean, and whether it can give us the type of lifestyle that we want. And so I think because of these crises that we're facing, it's really forcing us to have a conversation and take a hard look at philosophies, a sense of ourselves that we took for granted, and to start to question that. So now we're having this political conversation of, are the Democratic candidates socialists? What does that mean? And when you try to address the economic problems that we're facing, and it's pushing against the capitalist frame, then how is that reframing what America looks like and what it thinks of itself? Particularly when the reaction that led to the election of President Trump is that this economic dream isn't working for me, and I'm looking to this person to change that narrative because the systems and the political structure of old isn't working for me any longer. And we have to ask ourselves if the current trend is or is not going to work for us, and what does that mean moving forward?
So as we draw to a close, moving forward, are you optimistic or pessimistic or neutralistic, my word, that the American personality, the can do, we can conquer every challenge, that American personality will assert itself and that we will continue to have, quote unquote, an America that drives a worldview that people in general could also aspire to be more and have more? Which are you optimistic, pessimistic, or neutralistic?
I'm going to say optimistic, even though my first reaction was neutralistic. But I'll tell you why I'm optimistic. I look at young people and see how they are engaging in the world and how they're moving the dialogue and how they're challenging all of the ways that we worked before and are pushing us who are now moving into the elder sphere of life to challenge the assumptions that we make. And they're also not sitting around and waiting their turn, but are engaging and forcing change. So I'm really putting my faith in the young people who are forcing us to have very difficult conversations about the future. And I think with that engagement, we do stand a chance.
So last question. You are working, you're in the trenches, and you have children. So looking to 2030, when you will be 11 years older and things will have happened in your own life, based on the work you're doing now and the work you consider yourself to be doing in the next 4 to 5, 6 years, what is a positive headline story from 2030 that you would want to see in 2030?
A positive headline would be that there are a lot of diverse young people who are part of our political leadership. We see that trend moving in the 2018 election when you look at who was elected to the U.S. House, one of the most diverse bunch of elected officials, very young, and women. And the role of women in the political conversation and how women are changing the dialogue about what's important and what we should focus on. So I wouldn't say, the young people have taken over and they're changing American democracy. That's going to be the headline.
Well, thank you so much, Marcia Johnson Blanco from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights on the Law, for this very insightful conversation on the future history of Black America from a perspective of political inclusion. And I want to say that's it, folks, for this conversation. I want to thank you for joining us on Futures Forum Live, where we explore salient ideas for sustainable futures. Remember, the future is embedded in the landscape of today. And so I always urge, go out and seize the future, create the future you want today.
Thank you.
All right. So until next time, as we say in Jamaica, walk good and safe journey.
You have been listening to the Futures Forum Live online. This podcast aims to tell and share stories about the emerging future and help us better shape the future we want. The Futures Forum Live online is a production of the Futures Forum in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Get future sense now. Remember, our future is embedded in the landscape of the present. Share this story and share the future.